Welcome to the Radical Truth Podcast. I am your host, Glenn Meldrum, and this podcast is brought to you by In His Presence Ministries. Visit us on the web at www.ihpministry.com. Abraham was a radical, as we have seen in the last two lessons. Why was he a radical? Because of his courageous, persevering faith. Abraham knew God in a real and intimate way, and fully believed that whatever the Lord said, promised, or commanded was true. So he obeyed the Lord no matter how hard things got. On a personal basis, he had predominantly silenced the mental debate of unbelief through the exercise of his faith, and this developed in him a strong, courageous faith. That doesn't mean that there weren't times the patriarch of Israel struggled with unbelief, for it's certainly something that we humans have to deal with at various times in our life. It's just that Abraham made the choice to silence those voices of unbelief, doubt, and despair by choosing to believe God instead of the lies that come from hell. In our last lesson, we also began looking at the radical faith of Moses. He also was a radical because he had courageous faith that persevered until the answer came or deliverance was complete. Both Abraham and Moses had their journey from unbelief to faith because both men grew up in a pagan environment. Abraham was raised by a father who was an idol worshiper, while Moses was raised as a prince of Egypt who worshipped the vast array of Egyptian idols. The difference with Moses is that his birth parents were followers of the Lord, though they weren't allowed to raise him. We see that both men forsook the pagan culture that they were raised in after they came to know the Lord in a personal way. We aren't told how either of these men came to know God, but the fact that this wasn't revealed to us is typical in the way that history was recorded in ancient times. Though there are many similarities between these two men of God, we also see that God worked with both men in different ways, which was according to their personal needs and the divine call that was given to them. What makes these two men alike is that after coming to a knowledge of who the one and only God is, they forsook everything to follow him. They both had come to love the Lord with their entire being and to obey him fully. This made it possible for them to have great faith that opened the door of heaven so that they could see God do miracles that were unique to their calling and need. Their example of faith and obedience should be to us a model for us to seek to emulate, because if they could trust the Lord to such an extent, then so can we. Since God isn't a respecter of persons, he is able and willing to do the miraculous through anyone that chooses to live a life of radical faith, explicit obedience, and to have their hearts set on fire in love for Jesus. In our last lesson, we had left Moses in Egypt, standing up against Pharaoh, and the 10th plague was about to be unleashed upon Egypt for her persistent unbelief and rebellion against the Lord. This is where we will pick up right now. We are told in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 28, that by faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. This is the account of the first Passover that became a yearly festival to celebrate God's deliverance of Israel from their bondage in Egypt. This was a prophetic miracle that found its ultimate fulfillment in Jesus, the Lamb of God, who was our Passover sacrifice. He died once and for all, the ultimate perfect sacrifice, so that no other atonement for sin was necessary. All the Old Testament sacrifices were temporary, for they were only a covering over sin, not the removal of sin that came through Christ. I find it interesting that this verse refers to the Lord honoring the faith of Moses, and that through his faith the children of Israel were delivered from Egypt. The verse states that by faith he, Moses, kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood. As the leader of Israel appointed by God, as he went, so would the people. Moses had to be the example of faith and obedience to the people that knew little of the ways of the Lord and had been influenced by the idolatry of Egypt. Moses gave the people the command to sacrifice a lamb without blemish and to take the animal's blood and to paint the doorposts of the front door of the house. This was an act of faith by Moses and the people who obeyed the command, that they would be protected from the final plague that would take the life of every firstborn person and animal that wasn't protected by the blood covering. The 9 prior plagues that came upon Egypt had built the faith of the people to believe that they needed to obey the Lord's command that came through the prophet Moses. The Lord told Moses that an angel of death would destroy the firstborn of the Egyptians and any in Israel that refused to believe what the Lord commanded. The only people who would be spared were those in the homes that were sprinkled with the blood of the Paschal Lamb. The slaying of the firstborn of men and animals was also a judgment upon the gods of Egypt, many of which were represented by various animals. There's a controversy over who constitutes the firstborn, and I'm not going to get deep into this because it doesn't have any real significance for us today. But there are three options. First, it could refer only to firstborn sons. If there was no firstborn son in a family, the family did not lose a child or a father if he wasn't the firstborn. This is the most prevalent view of the subject, and the one I hold to. Second, it could refer to firstborn sons, but if there was no firstborn son, the family lost its firstborn daughter. Third, it could refer to the firstborn child of a family, whether that child was male or female. The situation becomes very complicated if a man has more than one wife, or if a wife had more than one husband. When it comes to animals, it was the firstborn male of the female, not of the male. However this exactly played out, both Hebrews and Egyptians knew that the judgment came from the God of the Hebrews, and there was no question about this. The fact that a lamb had to be slain and the blood sprinkled on the sides and top posts of the door demonstrated the people's need for atonement for sin. This fact will only come out more clearly and strongly as the Lord gives the law to Moses, so that he could give it to the people. The law of atonement is seen in Leviticus chapter 17, verse 11. For the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on an altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life. We see then that without the shedding of blood, there can be no forgiveness of sins, as Hebrews 9:22 states. In fact, the law requires that nearly everything be cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness. This need for atonement reveals the sinful condition of the people and that their sin was so exceedingly evil that it took the blood sacrifice of an innocent lamb to atone for their sin. Yet even with this knowledge of the need of atonement, dead religion set into the hearts and lives of Israel and the religious elite. Jesus confronted this terrible problem of self-righteousness that blinds us to our sinful condition and alienation from God. In Luke chapter 18, verses 10 through 14, gives the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. In verse 10, we are told that two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The temple would have been a regular meeting place for the Pharisee, but not for the tax collector that lived a sinful life in rebellion against God. The Pharisee prays his selfish, self-absorbed prayers that looked down upon everyone else because he couldn't see just how sinful he was. So the atonement offered him absolutely no benefit. In verse 13, we are told that in contrast to the Pharisee, the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, "God have mercy on me, a sinner." The tax collector stood at a distance from the rest of the people because he knew that he was a sinner and that his sin was offensive to God. He went to the temple because he had come to see his sinful condition and wanted to be free from it and to be reconciled to God. He beat his breast, which is a profound expression of deep remorse that's most often done by women at the death of a husband or child. Men rarely did it. The beating of the breast is only spoken of twice in the New Testament, and the first is in this parable that Jesus gave, and the second is when Jesus was crucified. We see this in Luke chapter 23, verse 48. When all the people who had gathered to witness the sight saw what took place, they beat their breasts and went away. The point is, with the tax collector, we see that he was in deep agony of soul over his sin, and this was producing in him genuine repentance. But the Pharisee didn't repent of his sin because he refused to see his sin. More than likely, these men were praying either in the morning or evening sacrifice, for this was a popular time to seek God. Even while the lamb was being sacrificed, the Pharisee couldn't see how evil his sin was, for he was blinded by self-righteousness. The tax collector, though, was the total opposite. He saw the lamb being sacrificed, and he knew that it was for him that such an offering was being presented to God. And so it was fitting that at such a moment, when the animal was slain and put on the altar of sacrifice, that the tax collector would pray, "God have mercy on me, a sinner." But actually, this isn't a good translation of what the man prayed. A more accurate translation would be, God, be to me a sinner an atoning sacrifice, or be to me a propitiation of sin. As the sacrifice for sin was being offered, the tax collector was crying out, be to me, O God, that atonement for sin. Jesus concluded that parable declaring that only the tax collector left the temple cleansed of sin and reconciled to God. The self-righteous Pharisee left the temple just as great a sinner as he had entered it. Though the Israelites knew to a limited degree that they were in need of sacrifice, this first Passover would begin to unfold to them their great need of atonement. The coming of the Mosaic law would instill this truth all the more into the hearts of those who wanted to know the Lord. All those religious people who really didn't want to genuinely know Christ will not understand their personal need of Christ's atonement. The Old Testament sacrificial system was limited in its power. Its purpose was to expose the sinfulness of mankind so that they could see the Lamb of God who takes away people's sin, not merely covers them up. The firstborn of Egypt was slain, while the firstborn of Israel was spared. Israel was spared not because they were morally or spiritually better than the Egyptians, but because they obeyed the Lord's command to sacrifice a lamb and to paint their doorposts with the blood of the atonement animal. This was about faith in God's promise and wasn't a mere religious act. Sin is real, and it thoroughly corrupts the individual, and no religious acts can cleanse anyone from the stain of sin that corrupts the whole person right down to their very soul. It takes a divine act, a real miracle to deliver us from our slavery to sin, and only faith in the God of atonement, who paid the highest price to redeem us, can do this work of deliverance and transformation for us. There was a literal angel of death that slew all the firstborn that weren't covered by the blood of the sacrificial lamb. And this angel of death is just as real today. For every person that isn't cleansed by the blood of Christ will die in their sin and be forever separated from Jesus in the agonies of a real and literal hell, and this is eternal death. Now we come to verse 29, where only a few days transpire after the judgment that fell on Egypt's firstborn. Israel was thrust out of Egypt, and then they were entrapped between the Red Sea and a vengeful Pharaoh and elite army. The verse reads, by faith the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. The Lord spared the Israelites, and even some Egyptians who decided to follow the Lord after seeing the power of God manifested through the 10 plagues. All those who were covered by the blood of the sacrificial lamb was spared from suffering the consequences of that last plague. And yet when it comes time to part the Red Sea, it was the result of the great and courageous faith of Moses that opened the door for the deliverance of the people. By and large, the people of Israel were in unbelief. Yet after the Red Sea was parted, it took the faith of the people to walk through those waters. Otherwise, the fear that can be part of unbelief would have immobilized them. Pharaoh and his elite army were bound by unbelief in spite of all that they had seen and experienced through the plagues that came upon the nation. When they pursued Israel through the Red Sea with an evil lust for blood, the waters came upon them and a great army was defeated. Israel didn't even defend itself, for naturally speaking, she was utterly powerless. God was her defender, and he proved to Israel and Egypt that no one can stand against him. Though this great deliverance was 100% the work of God, the Lord demanded that faith had to be an integral part of what he did. Of course, God can do whatever he wants apart from faith, and at times he has done this. Yet he has determined, according to his sovereign will and his infinite wisdom, that faith must be involved if we want to see an omnipotent God work mightily in our lives. And so we see that Moses had courageous faith that stood against the most powerful nation in the world and the unbelieving people of Israel. He came out of the spiritual battle a victor due to the infinite love of God. The next expression of courageous faith in Hebrews 11 is seen in verse 30. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the people had marched around them for 7 days. This doesn't mention Joshua, but as the new judge of Israel, the spiritual condition of the nation was directly tied into its ruler. This is a pattern that's seen throughout the history of Israel. A godly king or ruler would lead the people in a path of righteousness by serving and worshiping the Lord. All those compromised and wicked rulers led the people away from the Lord into the worship of idols and all the sensuality that it produced. People's default is the works of the flesh. So it seemed like the people quickly went back to their devilish ways when a wicked ruler came to power. Apart from revival, it took time to remove the people from their practice of sin and rebellion to serve the Lord. Joshua was a godly man that loved the Lord. It would be exceedingly hard to fill the shoes of Moses, but if anyone could do it, it would have been Joshua, who was Moses' attendant throughout the time that he was the first judge of Israel. There's one verse that really lays out why Joshua became the next judge of Israel, and it's Exodus chapter 33, verse 11. The Lord would speak to Moses face to face as a man speaks with his friend. Then Moses would return to the camp. But his young aide Joshua, son of Nun, did not leave the tent. Moses had a deep and profound relationship with the Lord. The Hebrew phrase for face to face is actually mouth to mouth. In other words, God was so near to Moses that it was as if he was in Moses' face, rather than just being in or near him. Wherever Moses went, Joshua, his aide, went as well, even when this isn't specifically mentioned. Here we see that Moses went into the tent of meeting, which was a tent set up for Moses to meet with God and get the commandments for the people, and Joshua was right there with him. This was the best school Joshua could have ever attended, for it took him into the presence of God and at the feet of a man of God. He also saw the life of a holy man of God, who was an example to him of how to live pleasing to the Lord and how to have great faith to see God do great things. Now this brings us to Jericho, that probably was a city fortress built on a hill and was ruled by a small king. Some have speculated that it was more of a military outpost and not a large city of that day. From the spoils of war that Israel gained, it appears that there was a certain amount of wealth in the city. I'm not going to get deep into this event, but just want to make a few points. First, in Joshua chapter 6, verse 2, we are told that the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men." This demonstrates that the relationship Joshua had grown into under the tutelage of Moses had taken deep root, and now Joshua had his own relationship with the Lord, who was speaking to him as now the leader of the people. The Lord gave Joshua explicit directions, and he shared it with the people, and they were willing to follow Joshua as they had learned how to follow Moses. As the people obeyed the command of the Lord to march around the city one time for 6 days, the faith of the people was being built up. Then on the 7th day, the people were to march around the city 7 times, which shows that it wasn't a large city that would have made such a feat very, very difficult. When they finally went around the city the 7th time, their faith had grown, and this was the purpose of the act, to build their faith in a God of miracles and to help the people trust Joshua as their new leader. I'm sorry to say that some of the commentators and authors of Bible encyclopedias get really stupid at this point and are filled with terrible unbelief by reducing this miracle into a natural disaster. I won't go over this because it isn't worth our time. This is a divine act of God, not a natural phenomenon. The Lord responded to the people's faith and gave them a great victory to start them out in their conquest of the promised land. It was the faith of Joshua acting in obedience to the Lord that helped the people lay hold of God's promise by faith, and the Lord responded to their faith with a resounding crash, that is, with the walls of Jericho coming down. Without faith, this miracle would have never happened. Now this leads us into the next expression of great faith, and this is of the first woman mentioned in the hall of great faith, and we read this in verse 31. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who are disobedient. Before we go any further in this act of faith, I want to look at the woman herself, and specifically her occupation. In Joshua chapter 2, verse 1, Joshua sent 2 spies out to investigate the fortifications of the land, and especially those of Jericho. The spies entered Jericho and went into the home of Rahab. The text states that she was a prostitute, but the Hebrew word can also be translated as innkeeper. Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian, wrote that Rahab was actually an innkeeper. Those who want to label her as a prostitute can at times go to great lengths to press this point home. But then the same is true for those who want to believe she's an innkeeper. In the New Testament, she's called a prostitute, and there's no other option for the word that's used. Yet this all gets very complicated as you dig deeper into the issue. You have strong proponents for those who believe she was a prostitute and for those who claim she was an innkeeper. To me, some of the hardest obstacles to deal with is that Rahab was called righteous and a woman of faith, that spies who were of good reputation in Israel stayed with her, and that she ended up marrying a prince of Israel. These points make it hard to accept that she was a prostitute, which would have made it very hard for a woman to marry a righteous man because such a union would have been forbidden. No matter what we believe about her occupation, what we know is that her act of faith saved her and her entire family. That she is in the lineage of Messiah is just another expression of divine grace. For who in that entire lineage had the right to such a privilege? That Rahab protected the spies that came into her house and let them down by a rope to flee the area tells us that she really did believe that the God of Israel was going to destroy Jericho because of the great evil that was practiced there. Well, if she was a prostitute, she was part of that great evil. After showing mercy to these men, she cried out for mercy from them, and by her faith she received mercy. No one is saved because they show mercy to others, but because they cry out to God for mercy. She chose to believe the promise of mere men, who declared that everyone in her house would be saved, and a sign would be a scarlet cord tied in the window. Some have tried to say that the scarlet cord was just another proof that she was a prostitute. Yet when you look at the tabernacle, it had scarlet thread throughout it. I think it's more of a prophetic symbol of Messiah's sacrifice than anything else. By faith she didn't die, and by faith she became part of the lineage of Messiah, and by faith we gain eternal life and become adopted sons and daughters and actual heirs of Christ. The story of Rahab and the great faith that she acted upon is just another expression of divine grace in action. Moving on to verse 32 of Hebrews chapter 11, we read, "And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Japheth, David, Samuel, and the prophets. All these acted in faith to obey God and perform whatever exploits he required of them." Paul acknowledged in this verse that the accounts in the Old Testament about men and women of faith are too abundant for him to list. It's not only that he didn't have time to write down a fuller rendering of the accounts, but the cost of writing and reproducing a longer epistle would have made it prohibitive. Given this real situation, the author makes a brief summary of some individuals who lived by faith or performed an act of faith that was beneficial to mention. I will highlight these people and express how they lived by faith or acted in faith. First in this list is Gideon, and in the historical record he comes after Barak. But it may be that Gideon is mentioned first because he was more known of the two. And it's a similar issue with Samson and Japheth. The account begins in Judges chapter 6, verse 1. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. Their servitude to the Midianites was absolutely brutal. But this all came about due to their rebellion against God, so he gave the people over to their oppressors. Then in verse 6, we are told that Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. So the Lord sent a prophet that rebuked them for their willful rebellion. So the Lord sent a prophet to Israel that rebuked them for their willful backsliding and rebellion. Nonetheless, the Lord heard their cry and sent an angel to Gideon. I'm not going to take time to go through the whole story, but when the Lord called Gideon, he tried to make an excuse to get out of it. The Lord didn't say that he would wait for Gideon to become a man of God, but that now the time had come for him to rise up and be a man of God. The angel of the Lord said in verse 14, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" The fact that the Lord was with Gideon was all that he really needed. God was sending him. He was to go in the strength that he had, and the Lord would then supply what he needed when he needed it. This is one very important principle of faith. Now is the time to operate in the faith that we have, and as we operate in that faith, it will grow into greater faith. When the angel of the Lord left Gideon, the man proclaimed in verses 22 and 23, when Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord, he exclaimed, "Ah, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." But the Lord said to him, "Peace, do not be afraid. You are not going to die." Now that was totally cool. The first act of faith Gideon performed consisted in his tearing down the altar of Baal and the Asherah pole, and then sacrificing a bull as a sin offering on a proper altar to God. He did this in obedience to the command of the Lord, but did it at night out of fear of the people. Though his faith was weak, he acted on what he had, and the Lord responded. News of what Gideon had done spread, and in verse 33, we are told that all the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples joined forces and crossed over the Jordan and camped in the valley of Jezreel. They were angry at what Gideon did and was now coming to kill as many people as possible to instill fear and submission into the people. By faith, Gideon raised an army of 300 men, and through them destroyed the countless multitude of Midianites and Amalekites. And Israel was delivered from the oppression and slavery they had gotten themselves into through their sin and rebellion. It took a man of faith to accomplish the work. And when we look at Gideon's reluctant faith, we can have hope that the Lord will use our faith right now in the world in which we live. Second in Paul's list is Barak. The context of this account is similar to what we saw in the days of Gideon, which came after Barak. In Judges chapter 4, verses 1 and 2 tells us that the Israelites once again did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, a king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor, and the commander of his army was Sisera. The serious nature of this oppression is seen in verse 3, where King Jabin had 900 iron chariots and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years. They cried out to the Lord for help. In those days, an iron chariot would have been like having an M1 battle tank today. This was a powerful army that was led by a capable general. The oppression was so great that the people finally started to cry out to the Lord. Why does it take so long for us to call out to the Lord when we are suffering under the consequences of our rebellion? In the Lord's mercy, he heard their cry and raised up Deborah, a prophetess, who was the judge of Israel at that time. Through a word of prophecy, Deborah called Barak to lead an army of 10,000 men against the military might of Jabin to break their oppressive hold upon Israel. Like Gideon, Barak was reluctant, but he went at Deborah's command and overthrew the host of Sisera and his 900 iron chariots, and this was a mighty feat. That Barak obeyed Deborah and showed valor in battle against the enemies of the Lord was a result of his faith in God and in his prophets. Yet in the account, it seems that the one with the greatest faith was Deborah, who, against all cultural norms that didn't embrace women leaders, obeyed the word of the Lord and became a judge of Israel. And then, as the judge of Israel, she called for Barak to lead an army. Barak wouldn't have led the army unless Deborah went with him, which reveals that his faith was weak, but the Lord still used him. The victory for the battle went to Deborah, who was truly a hero of the faith and lived a courageous life of faith that put men to shame. Centuries later, it was women that showed the greatest love and devotion to Messiah. They watched him be crucified and buried in a tomb. And they were the ones that went to the tomb on that Sunday morning and believed the report that Jesus had risen from the dead. Thank God for women of faith. Thank you for listening to The Radical Truth with your host, Glenn Meldrum. We at In His Presence Ministries pray that this weekly podcast will be a blessing to you. Please tell others about it and subscribe yourself to this free podcast. Don't forget to visit our website at www.ihpministry.com. See you again next time, and may God richly bless you as you seek Him in spirit and in truth.
And thirst no more, so come wash in the river, come drink your fill.